Welcome to the Grid Mod Pod, brought to you by AEIC. In this podcast, you'll hear from the utility industry's top operations leaders on how their companies are working to modernize and improve our ever-evolving power grid. Thanks for joining us.
I'm Dr. Elizabeth Cook, your host of the Grid Mod Pod and Vice President of Technical Strategy at AEIC. On today's episode, I discuss how advanced distribution management systems are helping utilities strengthen reliability and modernize grid operations with Joe Clark of Duke Energy. This issue is grid modernization, but it does not always begin with something entirely new. Often it starts with better understanding the assets, systems, and operational realities already in place, and then building on that foundation in practical ways. The ADMS efforts like low voltage management, fault isolation, and service restoration are all helping utilities improve outage response, automate key functions, and create a more connected operating environment. But success depends on more technology alone. It also requires strong coordination between IT and operations, knowledge of field realities, and leaders who understand that modernization is a steady process built over time. So in this episode, you'll hear from Joe why understanding exact assets is a critical first step in any grid modernization effort, how automation through ADMS, low voltage management, and FISR can improve restoration times, and why communication, field awareness, and a long-term mindset are essential to making these efforts stick. We hope you walk away from this podcast with insights and momentum needed to spark change in our industry. So, Joe, thank you for being here and welcome to the pod.
Happy to be here. So, as Liz said, my name is Joe Clark. I'm the product manager for the ADMS delivery team focused on the advanced applications. We are a technology delivery team focused on implementing the advanced applications that sit on top of our DMS and control system. And really, we act as a line of defense for our grid operators so that they understand how the software should work, how it does work, and then we act on their behalf to work through issues with our vendors to make sure that any defects that we identify, any behaviors that are less than ideal, we take those back to our vendor and we work with them to resolve that so that our operators are in good hands and they know exactly how that software is going to serve them. Focusing on the advanced applications, we focus on low voltage management, LVM, as well as the fault isolation and service restoration, FISR. We are currently really focused on the FISR implementations across jurisdictions. We have 4 jurisdictions within Duke. We are active in 3 of them. One of them in particular, we are kind of wrapping up the implementation. We've handed that off to the business. So I think we'll talk about that throughout this opportunity.
Yeah, I love it. So for our listeners, the core of grid modernization, when we go back into the literature, I have said this before, it's an evolution of what smart grid was really in the 90s and early 2000s. And we evolved to this language around grid modernization, but the essence of it was not really modernizing and being smarter or becoming the future. It truly is modernizing the grid as is, understanding the assets that are currently in existence, and then giving advanced applications to the utility operators, field employees, planners, really the full route. But the original progressive pyramid, which I love to talk about, is there's foundational work, there's IT infrastructure, there's communication infrastructure that really are required before you can get to these elevated, and as you shared, you're at the level of where advancing applications on a distribution management system. So a lot of work has already been done. And so it's a continued evolution of where we're headed in regards to these advanced applications that you spoke of. So it's really the essence and kind of maybe the original concept of grid modernization, coming to life. So I'm really excited just to talk through it because I think a lot of us externally, seek to think that utilities have this accessibility of information and can execute in near real time. But being able to communicate the story that you're about to share, there takes a lot of vested interest in understanding the process, understanding the data, cleansing the data, et cetera. So I look forward to jumping in and kind of hearing that journey and really the people part, right? Because this is a big endeavor. And like you just said, you're doing it across 3 service territories. So now you have 3 entities that you're interacting with and deploying. So it's going to get juicy. With that stated, we're just going to throw up a softball. What problem, and I don't know how far back you want to take it, but what problem were you trying to solve with this particular advanced application, and why did it matter at the moment for Duke?
Yeah, so really the core problem that we're trying to solve is the delays that we saw in service restoration to non-impacted customers. We identified this a while back. Now we have the field instrumentation to support decisions in a more automated way. So we're taking that onus off of the operators to restore customers and doing it in a more automated manner. That has huge dividends for us because what used to take multiple hours to days can now be done in minutes. It's amazing how quickly these technologies can assess where a fault is, isolate it, and restore customers on adjacent circuits. It's incredible. So that's really kind of the crux of the matter.
So that context is helpful. And just for our listeners, we also in the industry say automation quite a bit. And so automation could be many things, but another expectations are dangerous anyway, is, when we talk about like, why are these capabilities now being advanced and why haven't they always been around, is sometimes is like a question that maybe those that do understand ask. And so like, when you said it could take hours or days, like there was a very thorough iterative process that ensured safety, the awareness that was available to all people involved. And then really the aftermath to understand said problem, was you had to extract the data, cleanse the data, do the data every single time. So the automation part is what you're speaking about, is that you said the word, you had the devices in the field implemented. So you actually have to deploy, spend resources and human power to actually put the physical hardware out in the grid to then extract the data, build software, either build or buy, that's a whole other journey, to then execute this increased reliability. So like and it pays off in dividends because you go from hours and minutes to seconds, right? And that's so beautiful. So just thinking about the people part, right? You're in the organization, which, like kind of where do you fit? Like when you think about how you evolved in the process, right? Like, so moving from planning into execution, like how was that for you and how is it for your team and kind of the company?
Yeah, so kind of the role that we play in all of this is in delivering that technology. We also need to provide all of the work streams and infrastructure necessary to get to the enablement process, right? We have the construction component, which gets the physical devices on the grid, and then they hand it off to us when construction's complete, and it's basically ready for enablement within the advanced apps sphere. So we go through a review process. We set up that infrastructure such that we go through an initial review, a secondary review with an independent person, kind of basically checking the same things to make sure that we eliminate the human errors there. We set up work streams for any items that we have identified within that jurisdiction that are kind of a nuance of that jurisdiction. We may enter an area and they may lack breaker fault targets or something along those lines. So we would build the infrastructure to get that information into our SCADA system so that we could leverage that in our ultimate restoration plans. So we are ultimately building the business processes that will be handed off to our business partners so that they can keep this going long term.
And just think about like another misnomer, maybe, or like an oversight, especially from those that like create the concept, or maybe the executive leaders that like, well, let's go get it done. There's like a labor of love is like, you first must understand your current process. And that this whole, let's just say, restoration process touches, my guess would be, a dozen different players through the business unit, right? And on top of defining that, which not everyone likes to do, right? Like, why are you asking me about my process? Or is there even a process? Then you're building additional or adapting or changing or creating new. And as like what you said is like, as you're doing it, you're going to find anomalies. You're going to find differences between service territories, garages, field crews. Not that they're wrong, just that they've evolved in a way that they have. And so you have to like build that into your project. And then as a program manager, you have to understand all of that. So my point to belabor you is like it's a labor of love, and it's not technology. It's really able to like define it, communicate it, move through it, continuous improvement to really make these projects work. So in that process, like, from your learning experience and perspective, like what outcomes or like impacts stood out, once, maybe you had like a win, or maybe even had like a trip up, no pun intended to the fault isolation, but if you have a mix up or a lessons learned, what was like something like that was really expected, but then also unexpected?
Yeah, I'll focus on one of our Carolinas jurisdictions where we had a couple of key items that have really kind of enabled our success there. And part of it is just being open to change, being flexible, and saying yes to opportunities. In the project world, we start off with a specified scope. We're going to go in, we're going to enable circuits, we're going to transfer them from one self-healing technology to another. That's our focus. So we go into that, and in this jurisdiction, we were presented with an opportunity where, hey, here's a lot of circuits that have construction completed, but they're just waiting on this other technology to implement. How about we hand some of those off to you all, and instead of you focusing on transitioning from one technology to another, we enable net new circuits, and we all benefit from that. Because it was a big enough backlog that they could afford those circuits to hand over.
Okay.
So we looked at that, different than our scope, right? But made a lot of sense, a lot of benefit there to get, a net new circuit gets you all of the benefit from self-healing, whereas a transition from one technology to another gets, an incremental shift. You might go from 90 to 92% as opposed to, going from 0 to 92%, right? So again, made a lot of sense to just go ahead and rescope and change focus. So we did that.
Nice.
And then, a couple months later, same jurisdiction come back and said, hey, we've got a reliability initiative. Can you pick up the pace? Sure. Yeah, we can pick up the pace. Now we got to figure out how to do that, right? So we worked with our asset management organization to bring in some contingent workers within the engineering realms that helped us to streamline our enablement process, as well as they had work management experience. So they were able to kind of route some of the corrective items that we identified during these reviews. They were able to route those, to the teams that would actually get them corrected, give them feedback, and really smooth that out. To the point where when we started off 2024, we had roughly 20 circuits enabled in FISR in this jurisdiction. By the end of that year, we were at over 240 circuits. So, great progress.
Right.
Fast forward it, to where we've actually transitioned it to the business in 2025. That was one of our focuses. And one of the keys there was we kept the business involved from the get-go. They were involved in the enablement process. They were involved in the decisions. They were involved in the planning, so their input was taken into account with the idea that this is a sustainable, this is going to be sustainable to where we hand this off. What do you want it to look like? And when you involve people from the get-go in a plan, they become invested in that plan working, as
Right.
opposed to if you're just handing off, my plan, then like they are not as invested in my plan working, they're invested in our plan working. So that was another key to success, is by, integrating them in early. We were able to transition this project in 2025, and they added another, I think, close to 700 circuits enabled in 2025. So again, by creating an infrastructure and work streams that were sustainable, when we handed off to the business, everybody knew their role. It was a smooth transition, and they just accelerated even more.
So much there to unpackage, because, a big part in why the grid mod pod exists, and originated was, how do you thread the story of those that are actually doing the work that you're just discussing and highlight it in a way that, one, those that are actually maybe in that crawl space, maybe, when their goal is to let's get 20 circuits across our territory under FISR, to all the way to the external folks that are like, well, what does it actually take? Like, I think there's a common theme is like, well, oh, you want FISR? Like it's like a line item in your like rate case or like your project strategy. But like it's not, you can't just turn it on, right? It is an iterative, gradual that scaling. So it's the phenomenon of crawl, walk, run. So what I heard you say is like you had a goal to like strengthen the foundation, bring the business in, which I'll caveat, like for you, your team is kind of like the ancillary team that supports the products that will ultimately serve the business. And
Right.
so that's an evolving space in the utilities where like the IT and kind of the ancillary services to support business, the need wasn't as integrated as the need is now for this very complex technology that you've been able to deploy. So bringing the business in to make it a very R project is a huge indicator of success. And I guess, just to restate your success is you were able to roll out the subset and then have the business adopt and then quickly gain scalability from like tens to hundreds in a very short period of time. And I think that's also a very hard story to thread in your rate case filings or your executive strategies or your cost benefit analyses of like, no, so if you allow us this large investment up front, it is a exponential payoff. And I think the more utilities share that and have it seen and done, the faster we can get to this full situational awareness of our grid. So love it. Thank you for sharing that. You kind of dabbled on this one, but this is kind of like lessons learned. So maybe for those folk that are really, maybe even at the beginning of like, okay, we want a DMS to get to where you are. Like, and maybe you weren't a part of that evolution, but like looking back, like what do you, and you indicated get the business involved soon, but like what lessons learned have you shared with really your peers, your team as that progressed and like how to get started and go from there?
Yeah, so the integration with the business is extremely important early on. The other part is team makeup. When we are trying to bridge the gap between IT world
Bridge
and
the gap. I
machine
love that
world
term.
and grid management, you know, they all kind of speak their own language.
Yes.
And if we are ineffective in translating from the IT language to the grid engineer language, then things are lost, and those losses can set us up for human performance issues. So one of the things that I highly recommend is like really try to develop some expertise that can span that like become that effective translator. I've seen so many issues arise from ineffective translators where the IT side will say one thing, the grid engineers will hear something else because in their terminology, it's different. And if someone can be there in the middle to help translate that, it's hugely beneficial. Heads off a lot of problems. That's another reason why business integration is good. If the business integration is sitting in the room with IT, it's a little easier to see when things aren't, exactly in line expectation wise, translation wise.
And really, like what you're talking about, and I heard you name three groups really like the operations, which is all encompassing. I mean, when we say operations in our world, that includes the planning organization, the engineering design organization, the asset management strategy overhaul organization, the control room employees, the field ops, right? It's a full breadth. And even that expertise across all of those is kind of you want to have a lot of, I guess you want to have a couple dozen of those people that kind of understand that overarching. But then what you just also brought is that ITOT world, which I think we throw around a lot. Like there's information technology and then there's operation technology. And I think sadly in our storytelling, some think that one can replace the other, but they both play a very unique part, right? Like,
Agreed.
so understanding those dynamics. And then I think the third group is the program group or Is it the bridge group, I guess? I forget the name you called it.
Yeah, just the project teams
Okay, the
and
project team.
the
So,
delivery teams that are delivering the technology.
the classic PM group, but for information technology, operation technology projects to serve ops. I mean, that's a whole development of relationships, talents, and conversation. And I think that's the meat of grid mods. So you like walk right into it. You got me excited. And at the heart of it, right, is everyone is being asked to learn something new and to become comfortable in a space that there will be change, right? So
Right.
as the project management team, the program manager, right, you are effectively managing the human response to all of this change. And I think if we talk about it more, right, and say it, it can't be like a meeting, right? It can't be like a get up there and present like we're going to change and let's get ready. Like it really is a labor of love where you're continuously threading conversations with all the unique personalities to really evolve that integrated team.
Yeah, that
There's your big lesson learned, folks that want to deploy a ADMS in the near future. So I guess pulling additional threads, if you don't mind.
yeah.
So here you are across 3 territories. I'm assuming like each territory is kind of a different maturity space, or like you're kind of evolving together. One's maybe
Oh,
leading the other two.
different maturities. Yeah.
Yeah.
We just
And-
started one jurisdiction, so they are in their infancy for FISR adoption, and our other Carolinas is basically turned over to the business, so they're kind of, we'll call it fully matured, and then we
right.
have
And
another jurisdiction that's kind of in between.
okay. And that's kind of like the state of everything, right? You have the trailblazer, the fast follower, and the laggard. They're all great, but the realization that one existed in the other. Would you say that the execution of the trailblazers has that made it or simplified or scaled the lessons learned and the language and maybe the tools and technologies and capabilities across the others following? Or is it like, and there's no right or wrong answer, or is it like, and I think this is something external folks don't understand. Every grid is like a snowflake. And I like to say every circuit is like a thumbprint. So there's no really peanut butter spread solution. I'm just curious, do you find that there are lessons that transcend and then there's whole new buckets of challenges that appear?
Yeah, it is both. We are able to take some of the lessons learned, but then also, we have nuances in each jurisdiction that make them different. We have different circuit topologies that we're dealing with. In one of our jurisdictions, we have a lot more of a sub-fed type of circuit topology that causes the advanced applications a little bit of fits right now. We're trying to work through that and get all those defects identified and corrected. So that slows that jurisdiction down. We don't have the backlog in some jurisdictions of circuits that are available for self-healing technology, but not yet in a self-healing technology. So you're up against a decision to do conversions from an existing technology to a new technology kind of early on. So that typically will be a little more cautious of a decision, right? As opposed to a net new circuit, which is a low risk option. So you kind of run into those nuances, between each jurisdiction on where their shortcomings are, what opportunities do they have, what opportunities are in the future that you can capitalize on. And, just that's why you have to be flexible, right? Is because you never know. But when one pops up, you better take
Right. So you have to be very agile versus being a waterfall executor.
it. Exactly.
So this is more of a personal question, but like, where was your background? How'd you find yourself in this space?
That's an interesting question. I have a very varied background. I spent a lot of time in coal-fired power plants. The bulk of my career was there. I served many, many different roles, a lot of industrial controls work, performance, condition-based maintenance, even down to managing the capital engineering, managing the O&M side of the house for a while. I got an opportunity to move over to transmission asset analytics, which was really kind of one of the things I really loved doing. So I got to work on a custom application there for our health and risk management, where we took all of the kind of condition-based assessments that were being done, pulled them in, performed analytics on that, and then we could train basically from the health scores of those assets, we could float the ones that needed the most attention up to our SMEs. You might have an SME that has the responsibility for 1,000 transformers. They can't give all of the attention to all of the transformers. So being able to say, hey, these 5 are really the ones you need to pay attention to was kind of the focus of that. So then the opportunity came up to move to DMS. So from transmission to the distribution side, I had always loved the controls. It was a great opportunity to kind of get back to something that I loved doing. The other thing that intrigued me was the direct impact on people's lives. With distribution, you're actually like, you can put names to outages, like, like these are
Yeah,
truly people's, it's somebody's grandmother in the dead of summer who's been restored thanks to what we're doing. So that became a very strong reason for pursuing this opportunity. So
I love it. I had the same experience. My first love was transmission. And then when I came into the utility, I was just asking a whole lot of questions of why certain transmission projects were being built. And they kept talking about this thing called distribution. And I was like, well, let me think about that. And so I asked a whole lot of questions about distribution. And then I got myself a second role, which is to manage the distribution planning. And that was the exact connection. I was like, oh my, this is like, I mean, you're assigning critical customers. I mean, the streets. Yeah, there's, it's the lifeline of society, and it's a connected thread. Love it. So what I heard from your experience is very versatile, and kind of you grew up or within the realms of the utility space, and you kind of understood the multiple dynamics at play, which is, I think, a key aspect, and kind of something you said earlier is, being able to like talk the talk in all the various rooms of the people that ultimately need to be part of this business decision process. Being able to have that connection is incredibly valuable. So I guess I'm going to ask another personal question, just because this whole project is a very people heavy thing. Is, for anyone that's maybe starting out, or, what you have seen as success, or maybe create great connection, like what are some values or like qualities that you see in other teammates for anyone that's seeking to maybe be a part of, advancing their analytics within the utility space?
yeah, I think conscientiousness is probably first and foremost. I like people who they want to do the right thing. So when you present an opportunity and say, look, this is the opportunity. This is why it's the right thing to do. I've met so many people that are just like, yes, let's do it, you know, and that conscientiousness and openness to taking those opportunities is huge. Self-motivation, in pursuing those, yeah, feeling empowered to do those things that you see as the right thing to do. I also have a core concept that make them tell you no. Okay, so I'm going to go until somebody tells
We're
me no.
kindred spirits.
and, and there are times where I get told no, and
Right.
that's fine. But
Yeah.
but I'm going to
Next
put that
opportunity.
always moving forward and until told otherwise, right?
Right. Okay,
So
so what I heard is, self motivation and consciousness of like what you're doing. And I think that's another reason for the podcast and the platform is like something about utility folk. Like if you work within the utility and then you connect with other utility peers, there is this amazing thread of your purpose, your work, your efforts are tied to your community and really the ultimate reality that it is the lifeline. So we don't talk about that enough either, especially when we're in the process of like recruiting and like building up the next workforce. So here we are giving it a shout out. Okay, so thinking about the ADMS, which is Advanced Distribution Management System, and you guys are effectively like pushing FISR through. I think you mentioned another application. Is there a few on your North Star that you guys are mapping out that really all of this effort and labor of love really, I think, will streamline or could possibly streamline unlocking in the near future?
yeah, I
Or
mean, we
concepts or
currently
ideas?
yeah, we have our LVM application. So voltage management is kind of ongoing with several jurisdictions already having systems that are up and running, business owning those. So we're not actively implementing them as projects, but we do upgrade their software when we come through and do SCADA DMS types of upgrades.
Would you
There
say that
are
that application's capabilities, a lot of its backbone is the similar backbone of the FISR?
Yeah, very much. They will bring in some additional field instruments of value, like more the regulator and capacitor types of measurements, get a strong focus. But yes, very much the same backbone extended.
And I want to caveat that, like in my experience, like there was always this need or desire or ask of those that want to drive advanced technologies is like, well, what's the cost benefit analyses. And so when you're talking about this full fleet of technologies, it's really difficult to like do one-offs because the core functions all are somewhat similar. So that investment is all in that bucket, but then the advanced applications then become capable. Well, you can't like do them all at once. I mean, it has to be a very serial, and some of them are parallel. So I guess I was pulling on that thread there in a
Yeah,
biased way.
from a cost justification standpoint, FISR is the easiest one to cost justify because you can tie the outages. You can make some assumptions on what the outage would have been compared to what it was with FISR. You can come
Right.
up with your customer minutes interrupted savings. You can look at SAIDI types of numbers. Easier there than it is for like an LVM. Your voltage management, you can look at some power savings indications, but harder to assign a value to those, and that makes them harder to justify continued projects. Not impossible, but it's
Right.
harder
It's
to
just
find that.
harder and it's a realization. And so like when you know, you know. And a lot of times when we don't know, we don't know. So knowing it, going into it is really valuable. And I guess just for our listeners, like when you're talking about the voltage management, so like a little history lesson, like the distribution grid really, evolved from the fundamentals of circuitry, but you have a node where it's receiving a source, and then we would run wires through the streets, and then three phase, and then they tap off to single phase, and you dip into your home and your commercial. And there was a simplified way, truly, to quantify the load, which is equal to a certain amount of draw, which then links to your voltage and your current. Well, anyway, the key to like a good distribution planner was enabling the voltage strength at your substation or your source is maintained within a certain level that's regulatory mandated to serve every individual customer. And so the math could really pencil out in a way that you understood and you could justify, and there was all these engineering solutions. And what has happened over the last 10, 15 years is the load and the changes to how customers want to interact with the edge of the grid is dynamically changing. So hence why you need these more advanced tools to be able to holistically manage the system. And so one part of that is managing your voltage, but no one really knows their voltage is bad unless you see like a flickering light. So that's kind of but everyone knows your reliability is missing if you're continuously losing power due to like some tree falling in line. And that's kind of what you were talking about, how it's easier to qualify, like truck rolls versus you didn't have to roll a truck. Cost savings. Yeah. I love it.
Additionally, in extreme conditions, by dropping the voltage a little bit, you can shed some load to the
Right.
point where you may not have to go to the rotating load shed technologies. So, keeping the lights on in that instance is a extremely valuable portion of the LVM technologies.
Right. I love it. See, and see, that's also hard to quantify because like the idea that the lights didn't go off is harder to state, knowing that you were, in the background managing your load in a way that avoided that. I mean, that's something that wasn't really qualifiable before this technology, but now it is. And it's kind of hard to measure yourself when you don't have a baseline. So now as these tools evolve, a baseline can exist and then we can exponentially improve. See, guys, it's exciting. Okay, well, this has been lovely. So, Joe, I keep asking kind of personal questions, but I always like to wrap it up from anyone seeking to be a part of the industry or to kind of get involved in, our space, what do you advise from where you're sitting and kind of the career path that you've had?
If you wanted to get started straight from the get-go, having knowledge of power flow, power engineering is a great place to start. It's not the only way to start. That wasn't necessarily my background, and I'm here today, right? So it's not impossible, but it's a great place to start for a younger engineer looking for these opportunities. The advanced applications build on top of DMS. So, any opportunity to get into, like a foothold into DMS knowledge is a start because, that knowledge is directly applicable to the advanced applications because they're built on that. I'm also a big fan of people who understand the field technologies because if you understand the field technologies, you'll understand how to utilize them, and you'll also understand like where their shortcomings can be to a point where, we haven't really talked much today about fringe cases. We are heavily dependent on model accuracy and field instrument accuracy.
Yep.
And I find that, if someone has only lived the life of the kind of the model side, then they don't necessarily understand how things can go wrong in the field. And so that tends to be a gap within our team, is because we are so heavily focused on testing software and kind of, again, translating between software vendor and grid engineers. So I think that's another great opportunity to kind of get a foot in the door.
Love it. So be open-minded, be versatile, and really understand there's many parts that really make up a whole. And so you don't know what you don't know. So learn by doing. So I love it. Well, thank you, Joe, for walking through this work and for sharing both the technical and the human side of implementing the Advanced Distribution Management System applications, ADMS, for us acronym lovers. I think this conversation reinforces why, one, this pod exists, is just sharing the common themes, the thoughtful problem definitions, and really that need for strong cross-functional collaboration, and then focusing on the people and the processes and this willingness to learn. I mean, that's kind of the core themes. And grid modernization doesn't happen all at once. It happens through efforts like this, where teams take ownership, walk through complexity, and share what they learn to others. And like AEIC's tagline, the knowledge of one is the knowledge of all. So I thank you for sharing your knowledge today.
My pleasure.
That's a wrap for this week's episode of the Grid Mod Pod. Thanks for tuning in. We hope today's conversation got you thinking about new and creative ways to improve our power grid. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to hear new episodes. This podcast is brought to you by AEIC, the place where operations leaders come together to share knowledge and provide guidance to the electric utility industry. We'll be back with a new episode soon. Until then, keep powering on.